Mr. Dyson and I have the honor to co-chair the meeting, and this is our first meeting of it with us in the chair seat, and so please forgive any failings that we have going through this process.
Have everybody identify themselves for the tape, please.
Pardon me?
Have everybody identify themselves around
I will do that. Mr. Dyson, you want to start?
Brett Dyson.
Introductions.
Eric Croft.
Tim Steele.
Dick Trainee.
Forrest Dunbar.
Pete Peterson. Dean Gates, Assistant Counsel.
Becky McPherson, Municipal Attorney. Jody Davis, Chief Assistant Municipal Prosecutor.
Justin Dolly, PD.
Let's go around in the back too. We got a lot of folks here that we need to know who are.
Bill Balti, I'm the municipal manager. Dr. Chris Reynolds, I'm here representing the Alaska Psychological Association. Kyle Parkwell, Behavioral Health and Wellness Manager, Eastern Ocean Tribes.
Melinda Freeman, the Director of the Municipal Department of Health and Human Services.
Albert Swank, just representing myself. Dave Donnelly, School Board.
This is Outer Beans Cafe.
Gretchen Petty, Chief Director of Community Rogers Park.
Russ Webb, resident of South Edition.
Cole Patteroach, resident of Rogers Park.
Tom Claymore, Anchorage Education Association.
Joe Schmidt, Anchorage School District. Tom Roth, Anchorage School District. John Garrity, Anchorage School District.
Jenny Knudsen, Anchorage School District. Lynn Young, Alaska Athletic Trainers Association.
Mark Wells, Anchorage School District.
Richard Henny, APD.
Ken McCoy, APD. Dennis Blanc, AFD.
MJ, APD.
Okay, thank you guys.
Identify yourselves.
Christopher Constant.
The first item on the agenda was a procedure for the first responders in public schools, basically the SRO program, and I wanted to have an airing of the program. There are some proposals to add personnel to cover the other schools, certainly the middle schools, and so that's something that we're going to want to at least get introduced here today and try to get some input in terms of how where we stand with that, whether we need to do that or not, and costs is something we won't have today, but it's something we'll have to look at as well. I think the way to start that is Chief Dahl, if you would give us a little overview of what we got, and then if you need some other folks to fill in on some of the specifics, have at it. Cheers.
Okay, thank you. So APD does have a school resource officer program. It's been in existence for quite some time. Right now, it consists of 15 officers, a sergeant, and a lieutenant. 15, right? The officers are assigned to the high schools in town, typically 2 per school, and then they're also responsible for the middle schools and elementary schools that feed those high schools. There are a lot of benefits to the SRO program. It's been very successful throughout the years. It is primarily a community policing and youth engagement program, and it provides officers in the schools to be present, be part of the educational process, and provide role models and mentors for students as they pass through the school system. And we find that it's been very successful. They also tend to have an effect on the overall safety of the schools just by their mere presence, and also through collecting information from the relationships that they build with students and identifying emerging issues and helping resolve them before they become problems. So, and like I said, we found the program has been in existence for, I want to say, about 15 to 20 years, and we feel it's been very, very successful so far. So we're very pleased.
Great. Other folks involved. Joe, do you want to introduce yourself?
Lieutenant Henning, currently I'm the commander of the SRO program. This is Acting Sergeant Wells. got nothing to add from what the chief said. He's spelled it out pretty good. We were conferring amongst ourselves. I believe the program started in 2003.
I was going to say one, yeah.
Mark, you have anything you want to add about the overall, what the SRO program is, what it does, how you guys function?
Well, I think you pretty much hit the nail on the head. We do function very, very well with the school district. We have great relationships with the principals. It does get a little bit frustrating dealing with that many schools. Some of the SRO programs in the lower 48, they do not include the elementary schools. That's something we've chosen to do. I think it's important that we do it. But that is just a lot of people to service. I mean, there's roughly 100 schools, if I'm correct, in the school district, and that's a lot of buildings to manage.
How do you handle this dispatch? 2 officers. In some cases, we have a middle school that's with a high school on the same campus, but that's not the rule. So, you're going to have to get in the car and drive somewhere. How often do you actually show up, those middle schools and elementary schools within that area?
Not very often. Usually the middle schools and the elementary schools, we respond for calls for service. So sometimes they call dispatch, and dispatch will get a hold of us and we'll respond to the specific middle school or elementary school. But every single principal and a lot of the staff have our work cell phones and our personal cell phones, so they will call us directly. But they've been instructed if it's a 911 call, you don't want to call Officer Wells and he's on another call, so he's not answering his phone. So they want to call 911 to get a quicker response if it's important. Otherwise, they call us directly a lot of times.
Do you schedule time for them? I mean, do you actually go out there and get to know your principals and the schools and that type of thing?
We do get to know them. It's not necessarily on the schedule, but we do, if we have free time, we do go visit our principals, just say hi, see how things are going, if they're having any issues. But we do not have the amount of free time we would today.
Okay. I do have a couple of questions. Mr. Trainee.
Chief, I've heard from the school district, they're concerned because the officers, they say, are only there 4 days a week. Are we having them there 4 days a week or 5 days a week? I know they work 10-hour shifts, but what have we done? Because I get calls from the school district.
Well, we work
Members of the
closely
board.
with the school district administration, and I think that's another area that the SRO program has been really good at, is making sure that that interface it happens all the time and that there's good information sharing. But the SROs are on a 410 schedule like most other patrol officers are. But there's typically 2 assigned to each high school, and so they have overlapping shifts. So one is typically there 5 days a week. And then, as Officer Wells pointed out, I think it's important to remember that for any sort of emerging problem in a school, they call like any other location would, and patrol officers respond to handle it. If an SRO is not present for one reason or another due to being at a different call for service, like he pointed out, or just not being there for that day for one reason or another, then patrol responds and handles the calls. So,
Is it possible to work with the union to see if you can adjust? I know it's a union contract for the hours they work per day. Is that possible for you to adjust that, or even, have you guys thought about talking to the union to see if we could move people, their SROs to?
it'd be a mandatory
5
subject of
days?
bargaining that this body would ultimately have to approve changing the contract to change their hours that way.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Other questions from members? Mr. Tice, do you have? No, I'm not going to, not yet. I'm not going to give up on this particular issue. I think.
Stand.
Yeah, I just wondered if you had any comments or questions on this.
Mr.
the program, from my perspective, has worked incredibly well. I've had kids go through the school system. The SROs have a tremendous relationship, in my experience, with the with everybody on campus, with students, with principals and teachers and faculty and parents and everybody else. And I think it works incredibly well. Mr. Dyson.
Yeah, perhaps I misunderstood the subject here, but I thought that we were going to hear about how to respond to a crisis, active shooter sort of thing. Is that not what was planned, Mr. Croft?
I didn't. No, I think Mr. Traney and Mr. Donnelly, I know, had some requests for these items.
Right. So what did you guys have in mind? And it did, when you said first responders, I wasn't thinking of the resident guys there who do a great job. I was thinking about response to the crisis. Were you not?
Let's ask Mr. Donnelly.
Donnelly? Dave?
Sure. So I have two roles, of course. I have a role where I can speak for the whole school board, and I have a role where I speak for myself.
Does
So
it
you are a
differ?
parent of kids in the school district, aren't you?
Yeah, yeah, and as a parent also, of twins in the school district. So I do know the administration, the school district administration has for some time been talking to the chief and the APD about shifting the hours of our SROs to provide more coverage, because we have concerns that when there are only 2 SROs in a high school, and it's a day where only one is present, and if that one is ill or has some other conflict, then we could potentially have exposure there, have schools with no coverage at all. And we raised that question to the lieutenant at a school board meeting, and there really wasn't a clear answer to that circumstance. So we have a concern with that, and we do think that it'd be appropriate role. Well, I'm going to be very careful. I think that it's an appropriate role for the assembly to consult with APD about what ways we could maximize coverage without having to expend a lot more money. Now, I understand that the assembly, or however it works with the department assembly figuring it out, utilizes the SROs for other things when schools aren't in session. But there has been suggestions that the SROs, if we maximize their time during the school year, could take time off during other periods of the year, and thus get more coverage in schools without additional cost. But it would be subject to the contract employees, the police employees contract. Secondly, for myself, nationally, more and more communities are going to SROs in more and more schools. And right now, we don't have SROs in our middle schools. Now, we do have some middle schools, as you rightly pointed out, that are linked up with senior high schools. But those that aren't don't have an SRO present as a regular basis. And I think, as a parent and as an individual member of the school board, that's something this community ought to be moving towards. Because I haven't heard a person yet object to having more SROs in schools. I've heard lots of people object about many of the other ideas that have been brought forward for school safety, but nobody yet has said, you know, it's a bad idea to put SROs in middle schools. And I think that's we've got an exposure there, and I don't want to be responsible for ignoring that exposure as an elected public official or as a parent. So I feel like I'm doing my duty to bring that before this committee and before the municipality. Now, what I should have started with, if I was just doing a presentation, was thanking you guys. Thanking the municipality of Anchorage for the SRO program, because there's no way the school district could pay for it on our own right now. And I think I can speak for everybody in the school district of how grateful we are to the assembly and the mayor and the local government for having SROs in our schools. So I want to make that very clear. We're very grateful for it. In fact, we think it's a wonderful program, and we want more of it. Or at least, once again, I'm going to say I would like more of it as a parent and as a member, as individual member of the school board. Additionally, I think there's certainly an opportunity for more coordination between municipal government and school district as far as safety issues. We have begun a process of public meetings, ad hoc committee process, identifying things that the school district will prioritize. That process has begun. We've been getting some of those reports back from those committees. They involve lots of people, parents, educators, police, first responders of other kinds. And we're really looking forward to really getting down in the weeds on that. There are so many different proposals that are being explored by schools nationwide that it's really quite amazing, and the volume of information out there is really huge. But I do really think there's a need for better coordination between the school district and the municipal government, all aspects of the municipal government, about school safety here in Anchorage. And I really would like to see that bumped up. I think the school district would have an appropriate ad hoc role on this committee, even as we do have an ad hoc seat on the budget advisory committee. I think that would be a step. But if there's any other types of things that would focus exclusively on school safety, I think there's certainly an area where that would be very positive, I think, to bring municipal government and first responders and the school district all together in a room on a more regular basis, more institutionalized basis, because, you know, it just takes one bad thing to happen, and then we're sorry we didn't do it, right?
I have a couple questions. Mr. Dunbar?
Thank you, Mr. Steele. So I attended a budget advisory commission meeting maybe 2 weeks ago, and they raised the same issue with regard to SROs and the school schedule, talking about 5/8 versus 4/10s. I know we talk about the current union contract being an impediment in that regard, but I know in some other contexts, for example, with the extra rigs at the fire department, we had a side letter that allowed us to do this. Has there been any discussions like that? And is there anyone here who's not from the leadership of the police, but maybe from the union, or someone who just feels comfortable expressing the union's view? Would this be something that would meet a lot of resistance, going to a 5/8 versus a 4/10, just for those officers just during the school year?
Well, I can answer some of that probably for Mr. Dunbar, if that's okay.
Go ahead.
Thank you. I can't obviously speak for the union. I was a union member previously when I first got hired, and then had some experience with unions throughout my career. I feel like there would be some pushback, probably. In fact, the last time the municipality forced officers to go from a 4/10s to 5/8 schedule without bargaining, there was a pretty substantial lawsuit, and it played out over the course of several years. So there would, I suspect, there should be some level of bargaining. We typically don't do side letters anymore. I think that's something that the assembly sort of prohibited a few years back. And so any sort of change to the contract like that, and I'm sure that my boss will correct me if I'm mistaken, would have to come through the assembly and be approved. And I think that was a change about 4 or 5 years ago.
Can I ask a quick follow-up to that then? So for Bill, then, is that just for the police department, or how? I know we had some kind of side agreement that allowed us with the firefighters to have the extra, I'm trying to remember what, extra ambulance basically. And what was that process? And we did sign off on that at the assembly a couple times, I remember. So is that what he means by going through the assembly?
Yes, so anytime that you're going to be changing any of the text of any of the collective bargaining agreements, that has to come through the assembly.
So it's not so much we prohibited the practice, we've just said if you do it, you have to come back to us.
Correct. Yep, I believe that's correct. So, and then the other thing I would just throw in there is that, you know, the fact that there's not an SRO present at a school does not mean that the police department doesn't have an ability to respond. Having somebody present already is obviously an advantage, but we're typically pretty good at responding to emerging threats at the schools. We had one at South Anchorage High a few weeks back, and the first responding officer that became aware of the threat did what he should have and asked for a lot of other people to respond. We had detectives and off-duty officers and a whole series of people respond to help with that. So I don't want to leave anyone with the impression that there is no response just simply because an SRO is not present. But clearly having somebody with boots on the ground is an advantage to begin with. And then there was a second part of your question, Mr. Dunbar, that I think I missed.
No, I mean, I guess I'd like to hear the articulated reason why people who voluntarily participate in the SRO program would be resistant to going to a 5/8 schedule versus a 4/10 schedule.
3 days off a week versus 2, I think is the simple answer.
Okay.
And that's typically why the 4/10 schedule is desirable and something that the union bargained for, is the number of days off. There was a proposal a while back to allow SROs to work 5 days a week, but give them 10 hours of compensatory time every week, which really works into 15 hours at a rate of 1.5, and then that they would expend that over the summer when school wasn't in session. But again, that would be a pretty substantial change to their pay and benefits that probably should come in front of the assembly and would be required to, of course, as a change of the contract. And I'm not sure from an operational perspective that that's something that the department would be especially interested in, because obviously it would be generating a lot of time away from their normal duties. And we actually do use them for a substantial amount of things in the summertime when school's not in session.
On that point, how are they in the school at all? And are they only in schools that have a summer school program, or how does it work in the summertime? I know they a lot of the officers are on the bikes and they're out on the trails and stuff in the summertime, but do they still cover schools?
They do. We coordinate that with the school district, and so there are some summer school sessions that are occurring, and we make sure that those have coverage. But that's something that typically the lieutenant in charge of the program coordinates with the school district to make sure that we agree there's adequate coverage in whatever area they still have going on during the summer.
Yeah.
And then some of them do take some of their leave time during the summer. They as a whole, generally take less leave during the school year, and mostly that's voluntary because they know school's in session, so they'll try to plan their personal vacations during the summer. And then those that aren't doing either one of those things do end up getting used for special projects or bike patrol on parks and trails, or other things that we have going on around the department.
Dave, did you have a
Yeah, I was just going to
point?
follow up what the chief identified there. I haven't met an SRO that was opposed to some revisions. I've met several that are in support of some revisions, but it has to be negotiated through their union.
And I think that the support that I've heard is the support for the extra comp time, not so much giving up a day off every week. So, but maybe I was mistaken there.
Mr. Constantine, you're next.
Well, I'm going to pull this slightly in a different direction. Feel free to bring it back. But on the SRO program, we had a meeting with the superintendent and the school board here where we discussed this a bit. And I always ask the question, and it always comes up about issues of kind of how kids are equitably treated. And one thing that the superintendent was explicit was that Anchorage Police Department does not create an environment where there's this school to prison pipeline, where this is a national problem with these SRO programs. And so I just want to offer my thanks to your team for really being above par and excelling in ensuring that the law enforcement you're doing is supportive of community and not disruptive. So thank you.
Mr. Trainee.
To the chief and Mr. Falsey, I think you'll find an assembly that's willing to listen to a change to this, because I'd like to see them 5 days in the school. And if an assembly member needs to bring this forward, I'm happy to bring a side letter forward and support it on the body. Because we need, from my perspective, we need to have the police officers there when school's in session, 2 officers each high school 5 days a week. Just telling you from the assembly perspective, negotiate with the union and come to us. If we need somebody for a sidebar, I'm willing to bring that to the assembly to make sure this happens. And then, Chief, I've got something else for you off the record on this. The last meeting, we were talking about homeless camps. And right now, we don't get rid of the property because we have to store it. So I need from you is, I understand you don't have the officers, evidence officers to do this, so I need to know if we decide to go to that, from your perspective, how many evidence officers do we need to get you, and do we need a new building to store the evidence?
Yes.
Which is not here, but I just need you to start thinking about that.
We're kind of off topic, but go
I know.
ahead. If you have a
But I got
quick-
the chief here. I'm
quick
not going to bring him
response
back.
here. Good, Chief, go ahead first, and then we'll.
Okay, so the answer would probably be yes, we would need more non-sworn staff and evidence to process all that, and I might ask for 2 new buildings instead of 1, because it would be a tremendous amount of material for us to try to catalog and store. And as I've mentioned several times previously, the police department is at the critical point when it comes to storing stuff and people. We don't have enough space for all of our people in our existing building, and we are definitely and literally filled to the rafters when it comes to storing stuff. I may have mentioned last time we were together that we're planning on adding another detective to the robbery assault unit and going from 6 to 7 people there, which we think is operationally appropriate right now. That unit has spent about the last week and a half with measuring tapes trying to figure out how they can wedge another desk into their space, and so far nobody has come up with a solution. And so I think that person might have to sit on the floor, but we're just out of space everywhere. So.
Chief, just let us know what somebody can do to help you. And it's money, and that's what we do. We appropriate funds. So let us know how we can help you.
And that's one
Because we
person's
both got
opinion.
the
We haven't
same-
voted on that particular
It's the
issue.
public's opinion, sir. From I hear nothing from the
That-
public except clean the camps up, clean them up now. We're told we don't have a way to store their evidence, so that somebody needs to get involved with this. So
Thank
let
you.
us know what we needed to help you.
Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, how many officers do we currently have working as RSOs, and how many more would we need if we decided we're going to cover all the middle schools?
Oh, cock duty.
Sir, there currently are
50?
2 middle schools.
100?
You can use some homeless money for
That
this.
ratio, we need 20 people. 10 middle schools, sir.
Right now, we have one officer stationed at Clark Middle School, which also services Vegas. So he is assigned to both of those things. The physical office is at Clark Middle School.
Okay. I thought there was more schools than that.
So we might need 19 more?
So it sounds like if you're going to have one at each middle school and 2 at each high school, you'd need about 10 more officers to do that.
So if we have a very effective program, we want to double the size of it or add another 100 officers or whatever. Anyway, a good point. And I'd like to go to the audience in terms of anybody back there that has a comment or a question. I see the superintendent sitting there. She might want to say something, but I don't know. Oh, no. No, I'm sorry.
Jim, we do have our head of security, Joe Smith, here.
Yeah.
If you have any questions.
Jim, if you have any comments on it, one way or another, in terms of how it's working in your mind and where there might be some room for improvement and that type of thing, just to fill in the blanks.
I'd have to mirror what the chief said. We think it is working very well. We have a new lieutenant, Kenny, just started here a little while ago.
Yep.
And we've already had several discussions that were very positive. A lot of energy in the program. So, the only, even if I had something critical, now would not be the time because we're kind of at the verge of a new energy here. So, I think so far all indicators are very good. I don't know if ratios are important, but at the high schools, there's about 1,000 kids for every SRO, 985. In the middle schools, being that Clark is the only place that has SRO assigned, it's more like 3,500 to 1. So again, I don't know if those stats really mean anything, but it's quite a big difference between middle school and high school. So.
All right. Mr. Dyson, do you want to take on to make a transition here to the assembly ordinance that we wanted to talk about? Thank you, sir. Can't get along without that.
Yeah, thank you. So we'll take up Assembly Ordinance 2018-34. And the reason I put this forward is you probably have seen that it was recently that the state judicial department has dismissed proceeding on 7,000 misdemeanor charges just because of a lack of resources in the court system and prosecutors. As I understand it, our city prosecutors and law cannot go after misdemeanor ordinances that are not in in the city law. So that's the reason for just literally copying state ordinances on mandatory reporters, particularly on child abuse and related issues, to put it in the city code. It doesn't change any of the responsibilities of mandatory reporters whatsoever, just puts it in the city's purview. So child abuse, particularly child sexual abuse, is one of the great passions of my life, and I've seen it both with a multitude of foster kids and in our own family, and particularly sexual abuse wounds people's souls at a profound level. And it is my trial, hopefully wrong assumption that we are under the mandatory reporters are not reporting when they should. I hope I'm wrong on that. But we lead the nation by a factor of 3 or 4 on child sexual abuse, and of course that might be partially a reporting phenomenon. We may be reporting more, and therefore it appears worse for us than other jurisdictions. But be that as it may, the national statistics that I've seen show that the very young girls, the 12 to 14-year-olds, that their, quote, partner is often 5 to 6 years older. With the older girls, the 15, 16, 17-year-olds, it's much more likely for it to be a peer or somebody closely related in age. So if we can intervene and stop the serial predators and the guys that are older that are molesting the very young girls, nationally, the last time I looked, it was 4.3 or 4.5 victims. They do this serially, so stopping them sooner would appear to stop future victimization. So that's why I've put this forward. I'm hoping that the increased emphasis and hopefully public relations resulting from this will encourage more knowledge on the part of all of us as citizens, but also mandatory reporters. So as usual, Mr. Gates has done an even better job than what I expected in transferring the state ordinances to state statutes to municipal ordinances, and I'm going to ask Dean to give us a summary of what he has done. Mr. Gates?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, as he said, yes, we hope draft this ordinance is effective in mind to make the mandatory reporter law exist in our code. And I guess I wanted to explain just a little bit the structure of the ordinance. I guess when you look at the first section, the first law being enacted is 853 sitting explicit image of a minor. Why is organized this way? Now the mandatory reporter section first. Our penal code in Title 8 offenses, we have Chapter 8, offenses harmful to minors, and fitting these new offenses in the different code framework, it made more sense to do it this way. So I've amended this chapter with several new sections, and it makes sense the way it is. It kind of escalates the type of offense in order. That's why this 16 offense is first. Sexual abuse of a minor, sexual assault, and so, but we didn't have that specific sexual abuse of a minor offense. Now, Mr. Dyson had asked in terms of placing mandatory reporter law in our code. We also, in doing so, found that the state statutes have several misdemeanor level crimes and offenses against minors that are in our code as well. So suggested to him this time, why don't we add these as well? That's one of the sexual abuse of a minor. His main intent at the outset, though, starts on page 3, 854.5, mandatory reporter law. And as Mr. Dyson said, this simply incorporates and somewhat duplicates what's already in the state statute. So I had produced the statutes that we took from to duplicate or incorporate here in this handout. And if you compare them, you see we're not changing anything at all in terms of the mandatory reporting. Simply putting in our code So the municipal prosecutor or the municipal resources can be used to address the failure to report within the mandatory reporters to report. Now, another offense I wanted to point out that Mr. Dyson was very interested in making sure we have in our code is at the top, page 5, section 85060 is failure to report violent crime committed against a child. This isn't about mandatory reporting, that counselors, teachers, report that we on Title 47 of the Alaska statutes. This is taken from the state criminal code. And this is basically, we hear about a situation where teenagers are fighting, and the police are around with their phones, filming, and nobody's calling for the police. That's a federal to report a crime committed against the minor, It's an adult being a child, and nobody calls, and everybody's filming their phones. That's the violation of this crime here, 85060. So that ties in again to protection of minors. This is against conflict minors. And I guess you could call it a slight aberration here on the top of page 6. Failure to report a violent crime committed against an adult. If it's failure to report a crime against a minor, it's a misdemeanor. This one against an adult, in state law, these were enacted at the same time. They tie very closely, it's the same act. Same failure to report a crime witnessing against someone. The difference is a child and an adult. Against an adult, it's a minor offense. I guess it's not as important to protect adults, perhaps, in the state's view, but that is what it is. So overall, I just want to explain why it's structured this way and why we have this mix of laws and this one ordinance. They're all under the purview, the objective of protecting minors who are victims of crime and other victims, and making sure that crimes are reported when they're supposed to be, as is already called in state law, and now allowing all these resources to be used to that same objective.
Thank you. Mr. Dunbar.
Thank you, Mr. Dyson. And this is partially, I think, mostly a question for you, Mr. Gates, although perhaps, Fred, you want to address this as well. So we received a letter from Stand Together Against Rape opposing certain provisions of this ordinance, and then looks like another letter from Awake, which asks at least for clarification, if not for opposition. And it seems like they're particularly concerned about the reporting requirements as it relates to adults, and so I assume that would be the provision you're talking about here on page 6. If it's not, then please correct me. But then also, so you're saying that we're not actually adding anything, we're just following state statute. So why did they seem to be under the impression that we're doing something else, or were they also opposed to the original state law when it went in?
Yeah, they will have to speak for themselves. And I suspect Mr. Gates or I may respond to them. But Mr. Gates?
Well, if you look at the state statute for mandatory reporters, we're just incorporating it by reference, and it only says there's a reasonable suspicion for this list of persons, so teachers, counselors, physicians, people that maybe have some kind of or relationship with children in terms of mentoring, so forth. But I think that's why I pointed out this other crime, failure to report violent crime against an adult. It's not part of the mandatory reporter law. I think that's where Awake Star's confusion is. They're all in the same ordinance. And I think that was important for me to clarify here at this committee meeting. So I hope that can be communicated to them.
So
and it's clear for the assembly.
So
not
may I ask a
changing
quick
out
follow-up?
Sure.
reporters to report recent suspicion of crimes against adults. This other statute, this other law has only been there actually eyewitness to a crime occurring.
Okay, so just so we're 100% clear, it's eyewitnesses, not like traditional mandatory reporting, and furthermore, this section of this ordinance is already in state law, and the confusion is because it's in a different part of the state law. So,
yes.
Is that right, Mr. Gates? Okay.
And Mr. Dunbar, I was responsible for putting that in 10, 15 years ago. So it was a case in Reno. a guy transported his buddy back and forth to Los Angeles, knew that the guy raped a 9-year-old little girl in the restroom. They couldn't get him on an accessory charge necessarily. So I did research. This is called, in law, is called misprision of a child, but it assigns an adult who sees a child being molested, kidnapped, or assaulted a positive responsibility to report. You certainly can intervene, but it is also a positive defense if you're in fear of your life for reporting. So, and right after we got it passed, a case in South Anchorage, 8 or 10 boys raped gang raped 2 relatively young girls. I think one was 11 and the other one was 13. If Doles had signed that 12 days sooner, they would have been able to nail the guys who didn't do the job but stood around and cheered. And this, because most of them were adults, i.e. 18 and older, it would have given a chance to prosecute them and also to strengthen the idea that all of us witnessing a crime, particularly a crime against a person, have a responsibility at least to call the authorities, if so. That's the origin, and so that's what happened, and I'm either get the credit or the blame. Someone else? Any other questions? Mr. Gates, do you want to continue?
Fred, Chris is.
I'm sorry, Chris.
No, that's okay. Thank you. On page 2, line 29, that section. The only concern that I have with this is that I'm afraid that we'll capture minors making mistakes. And so I'm wondering if anybody's contemplated the idea of in that section, if it's 2 children, that we have a different standard. Because I don't want to find us reinforcing bad law that finds a 12-year-old a sex offender for the rest of their life for sending a bad picture.
Yeah. So existing law says that the perpetrator's got to be at least 3 years older in order to be doing it. And so the peer-to-peer thing, my wife's been a mandatory reporter a long time. You need to differentiate when kids playing games, and so on and so forth from exploitation. State law says the delta it's got to be 3 years. I have 3 guys I visited in prison many times who had a long-standing consensual relationship with their girlfriend, and they were 3 years older, and they're dealing with that long-term thing. Perhaps they should be, because taking advantage of that much younger child, and so on. But that's in state law. Maybe it needs to be revisited, but they were guilty, and so on.
So just, can I ask clarification then? So is it then your assumption that if 2 15-year-olds are doing this, then the state law protects them?
I believe so. Yeah. At least that would be open to
2 attorneys.
2 opinions.
Go ahead.
Ms. Davis is here and can provide specific expertise at the Halleys. I was just asking her on the line if this, I believe, and she can explain greater depth, but I believe that 850-030 would not create an offense that would require someone to be on the sexual offenders registry, but she can certainly clarify whether or not there's merit to the concern that 2 minors sending pictures of each other via text actually leads to that kind of lifelong consequence.
Right. I think that would be something that would be dealt with in juvenile court. It might be declared a delinquent and be proceeded down.
Yeah. And please identify yourself for the record.
Jody Davis, Chief
Yeah.
Assistant,
Yeah.
Municipal Prosecutor.
Thank you.
Municipal Prosecutor's
Yep.
Office. So
Legitimate point, not what we're aiming at right here is the reporters, but very legitimate. Any other questions?
Well, I just would ask that we look closely at that, and then if we need to come up with some language that would ensure we aren't creating a trap for people who aren't adult enough to know they were doing something that has consequences.
Mr. Croft.
So the 030 doesn't have this difference in age thing. The sexual abuse of minor 035 does, right? And 030 is just anyone. And I take it can't be their own. It says with intent to annoy or humiliate. If somebody took a explicit picture of themselves, is that a violation of 030? I guess if it has the intent,
They have a split personality.
Or if they're sending it to make someone uncomfortable.
It's, I think, a decent exposure. Mr. Gates?
Oh, I would just like to point out, as the drafter here of this ordinance, this section is exactly the same as the state statute. I rely pretty much on states vetting and when they enact the school law as for it to be valid, probably vetted, not overbroad, not vague. It's been on the books, I think, since 2012. So at the end of each section here of the state law reference, at the bottom here is 1161, 116. So if you have questions about how this law is going to work, we have state law ready to live with this week. How I would also say I concur with what Ms. Davis said, that someone in the age due process through the juvenile justice system. I'm not a criminal at 20, so I don't know exactly how that would work. I don't think it would be that long.
Mr. Chair, I just wanted to say, I think that, I mean, to second what Mr. Gates has said, this clearly simply incorporates largely state law into our code and shifts power to prosecute to the municipal prosecutor's office. I think a lot of the ramifications of this are practical in terms of what does that mean for our prosecutor's office, what things would fall on their plates, do we have the necessary support services to do these things? So Ms. Davis has a number of comments about this, and I encourage you, whenever it's appropriate in the discussion, to look to her for some input on what those practical consequences are for our prosecutorial team, what that would mean, whether we can do this.
Mr. Chair, just one last follow-up and I'll drop it. I'm not confident that the state law is effective, and in fact other states have seen this problem happen, and the protection is that it's a juvenile court. The court is going to follow the law, and so I would ask us to be very careful when we're using minors and kind of incorporating new law, that we are very sensitive to minors being minors.
Yeah. And once again, what this is aimed at is the reporters, not the perpetrators. But certainly there's a relationship. Any other questions? All right, any questions for Mr. Gates? All right, in the package that I've given you is a report from Child Protective Services. Anybody here from Child Protective Services? It's a pretty complete report. So by my calculations, if you're looking at the 12 to 14-year-old girls in school, it's going to be around 6,000. If you go up to through the end of high school, it's 8.5, something like that. Counterintuitive, but in our state, the child abuse, a third of the victims are little boys. And that's always startling to me. But I just encourage us not to think about just girls being the victims. It's still true that the largest percentage of the perpetrators are males. Say that I'm, gender prejudice, whatever, but that's what the data shows, not surprising to me. So I've asked Public Health for the number of reports they've seen of child abuse, almost none. I went to the school district. Are you the guy I spoke to when I was over there?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, okay. So these are not pejorative comments. I was very startled that the district did not have a record of how many kids had been reported as suspicion of abuse. Apparently the schools do. But when I went through this 10 years ago, every school or district I knew had those records. Be that as it may, the chief, who has always been very responsive, told me that in round numbers we had around 240 reports to the APD of suspicion of child abuse. Did I get that right?
I honestly don't remember, sir. I think we forwarded you that info via email, but I don't have it with me today.
Yeah, no, that's fine. And so, and Planned Parenthood has not responded to my request for the information on how many suspicions of abuse or sexual abuse. I hope that I will get that. Are there other representatives here of mandatory reporters? Yeah. Do you guys want to say anything or comment?
About that specifically, or in
Ye-
general?
The whole thing.
Yep, we have three items we wanted to address. First of all, so I'm Dr. Chris.
Come on up here and identify yourself. Stand up so I can see you and hear you. Please.
I'm Chris Reynolds. I'm a psychologist, licensed psychologist in Alaska. I'm here today representing ACPA, the Alaska Psychological Association, or state section of the American Psychological Association. So three things. Number one, ACPA and psychology in general support mandated reporting. It's in all of our ethics codes. We are a part of creating legislation that manages our field that, of course, has that in there, so we support it. We do have some concerns about the proposed ordinance. One question that I have is some of the language in the state statute was not copied directly from the state, or in the proposed ordinance was not copied directly from the state statutes, specifically the piece about legal accountability for organizations. I'm wondering why the change in language.
Mr. Gates? Give us a little.
I believe you need section page 4. You have a good point, but this was taken from 47, Alaska statutes 4770. D1 here is taken from Title 11 of Alaska statutes. It has general criminal liability provisions, and makes the organization that employs a person who commits a crime also responsible if they were aware or didn't address it, didn't take proper action, proper training, that kind of thing. I've included that provision from state statutes in this attachment that we passed out. So you're correct, it's not from the mandatory reporter statute. It is, though, here as part of criminal law liability generally. And Mr. Dyson wanted to be sure that an organization that's aware doesn't take action. I guess maybe the easiest way to say this is if you look to some high-profile cases like the Jerry Sandusky case back in Penn State, and some people in the organization were aware of the offense and didn't report the organization. As a result, suffered some liability, and that's basically what this tries to do.
We're not opposed to the idea about transfer of liability. My reading of the state statute is that it makes it very clear that there's transfer of liability when the higher-ups know about it, and when the person committing the offense is acting in accordance with the policies or as an extension of the organization. I don't see that protective language in the proposed ordinance. What I read in the proposed ordinance is just a blanket responsibility, which I fear, and I think some of my colleagues would fear, would make the owners of an organization responsible for sort of rogue actions on the part of a negligent therapist. That's my concern.
I can understand the concern. Perhaps we can look a little closer at this, and you can send me some comments about specific language, and Mr. Dyson and I can discuss that in further.
Thank you for bringing that up. And it's my intention to get this before the Assembly for a vote for at least a month, and get a chance to all the stakeholders to weigh in and to do best we can at crafting a very excellent tool. Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So do you have language that you would suggest that we insert with you at this time?
Well, I think a duplication of this language in the state statute 1116-130, we're not opposed to that existing language.
Very, very good. Good catch.
The third comment I wanted to make, I'll make it quickly. We're a bit concerned about some of the informal statements made by you, Senator Dyson. I believe many of these professionals fail to report these suspected cases. The cause is unclear, and characterizing these people as mandated reporters who shirk their duty. I would request that you provide some evidence of that, what sounds to me like an allegation of systemic professional negligence. Because if that's going on, we want to be on the front lines of addressing it.
Yeah.
That's serious to us. And if you don't have evidence of that, please stop making those statements in public.
Yeah.
Because I think it undermines confidence in our profession.
Yeah. And very good criticism, and get together with me and we'll make sure. My own experience, which is limited, is the professional counselors like yourself are doing a darn good job. And I'm worried about the institutional ones, and your point is well raised and well taken.
I can tell you that I contacted a board member that regulates my profession. There are 4 master's level boards that the board that regulates my profession. And in 5 years sitting on the board, he doesn't remember a single complaint of negligence of this type. So if it is going on, it's not showing up under those circumstances.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. My own experience paying attention is no one has accused somebody of neglecting their legal duty of not reporting. My view is it's happening, but there's not the accountability for it. And I hope it doesn't have to happen to teach people to be more responsible. But as the state law says, there's a potential here that a mandatory reporter who didn't report and that child suffered greater harm, and or there was a victim from the same perpetrators, that there could be a civil action on that, and state law is clear on it. I hope it doesn't have to get to that to make mandatory reporters be really responsible. And for my colleagues, the statute doesn't say that you have to know. You have a reasonable suspicion that a child is being abused, and your only responsibility is to report it to law enforcement or child protective services. You don't have to know. The reporter doesn't have to do the investigation. Simply reporting a valid suspicion.
We're on board with the idea that there are rogue therapists or therapists acting outside of the scope of what we're professionally mandated to do from time to time, and those therapists have to be held accountable.
Yep.
We're on board with that.
Yep.
My reading of the statements that you made was an implication of profession-wide systemic negligence.
Yep. And I apologize. We'll fix that.
Okay, thank you.
Is that the basis, Mr. Chairman, of this, that you feel like this is a very underreported by mandatory reporting?
Yep.
And is the evidence for that mainly anecdotal, what you got, or is there some study or?
Yeah, and I am wary of reasoning from the particular to the general. And from the last time I went through this, I think it's Title IX, you could get the statistics on the number of children that went to the nurse for STD testing, pregnancy testing, and contraception. And you could get the ages from those. And my view is, based on the data I've seen, to get to the very young girls, the 12 to 14s, that a large percentage of them nationally, the boyfriend is 5-6 years older. It may be that we're an anomaly, and our 12 to 14-year-olds that are being sexually active are not having older boyfriends. I don't think we are an anomaly, but that's it's a reasoning from the general, i.e. the national statistics, that we in Alaska probably follow it, and the fact that we have 2 or 3 times the national average of child sexual abuse makes it unlikely that we're not doing it. Any other further comments?
Well, still questions, so I'm just trying to, and you and I have discussed a little before. So is your sense that school and other institutional mandatory reporters aren't doing that because they believe it's consensual sex and they don't want to, they're being confided in and they don't want to destroy that confidence or get them in trouble with their parents?
I think some of them. When I talk to the school nurses, who in general I think are amongst the most compassionate and nurturing people around, that, I mean, some of them literally said, I've got a professional dilemma. I'm probably the healthiest adult contact this kid has. The word gets out that I'm gonna rat out her boyfriend, the kids will quit coming to me. And that's legitimate. Our state policy is that you report. And if we want to change our law or the state law and say that the mandatory reporter is school nurse, has that discretion. You know, that's a policy decision for us all to make. Mr. Dunbar.
I was wondering if you could hear from the municipal prosecutor representative about the practical effects of this ordinance.
Okay, I want to be able to question the school folks here. Let me come back to you. Sir, would you like to come up or sit up here so we can hear you?
I'm John Garrity. I'm the Senior Director for Healthcare Services for the school district.
Yeah. And did I misrepresent our conversation?
Well, as I recall the conversation, it was, do we have record of whether or not the school nurses are reporting? Am I able to query that? And is it in a medical record? No, it's not. The reporting is a paper report and is kept in a secured location by the principal. It is not added to any type of database that allows us to query.
Okay. Right. All right. Now, talking with the Superintendent Bishop, who I'm a great fan of hers, I understood her to say to me that when a child goes to the school nurse asking for contraception, pregnancy testing, or STD testing, that the school nurse gives that kid a sheet of paper that has the contact information on where that kid can go to get those services. Is that correct?
That's correct.
All right. And it's a policy decision for you, and I'm sorry that Dave has left. That troubles me because it releases, apparently, the school nurses from the responsibility of being a mandatory reporter. So a kid that wants to get those sexual activity related services only gets a referral and in essence a piece of paper, and so it excuses all of them from doing the kind of thoughtful and interchange with the kid to find out if they're being sexually abused, either legally or de facto. So that's a concern for me. Please comment.
I think it's going to be encounter specific that if the student comes forward and presents to the nurse a history that shows that and says, because of this circumstance, I want to get that counseling, is different than if a student comes in and just says, I would like to get it. And the nurse is not required to investigate to find out, well, why does this kid want it? Why is the student? They're just trying to help the student out. So I think when the nurse is presented and the student says, hey, this has happened to me and I want to get some counseling, yes, the nurse as a reporter is required to do that. But I don't think the nurse should feel that they have to be inquisitive and ask them, well, who was the partner in that?
Yeah, but if a kid comes and says, 14-year-old kid says, I want to get contraception and I think I might be pregnant, and oh, by the way, I've got a bunch of sores I never had before, and the nurse just hands them a piece of paper where they can go to get that services. To me, that's so clearly a strong indication that a child is being abused.
Well, that's they're sexually active, not necessarily they're being abused.
I have a question,
Chris
sir.
and Eric don't want to talk to. I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, and our state, well, but if they're that age, because of strong possibility that their partner is older than the 3 years, I would think that anyone, and particularly the nurse or the service provider, would have a responsibility as a mandatory reporter and a human being to pursue that.
I'd have to investigate.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's a policy decision, and I would enjoy knowing what your policy is and if the school board has approved that. Chris?
I think there's a root policy question that you're heading toward. And that is it the responsibility or the desire of the school district to provide the in-depth sexual education, counseling, and prophylaxis, and all of the things? Do we want them to be that? Or do we want to have members of the community who are qualified and skilled in those things to provide those services? And that we refer to them? Because I think that we can't be both. And I think there's a challenge of this issue of, if they come to you with the question of, I have questions about my sexuality or my expression of my sexual nature, that do we want those questions being answered by our school people, or do we want them being answered by people in the community? I guess I'll stop there, but I think that's the policy question.
Yeah, so it's not the policy question for this discussion on mandatory reporting of abuse, but you'll see the sections in here on all the education that the district chooses, you know, health education, which is fine. And I don't have any, personally have any problem with either the school or the parents referring a kid to get information. This has to do with mandatory reporters for sexual abuse of a minor, and that's what the law requires, is the reporting. So what I need to know from you guys is it true, as I understand from Dr. Bishop, that the school nurse just gives the referral information for those services, and then does that excuse those nurses from being a mandatory reporter, and that they're basically choosing to say, I'm not going to go any further with this, here's where you can go and get that information. Mr. Gates?
I would like to add one other fact to Mr. Dyson's scenario, school years. So all of that being said, perhaps it's just sexual activity. But if the school nurse perhaps knows that this young lady's student's boyfriend graduated last year, or sees her being picked up by a young adult male with a car, driving her after school and picking her up, you know, who's obviously not a relative, or something like that. I mean, I'm just saying some other facts that gives some kind of circumstantial, reasonable basis to believe that the person this young lady sexually active with is older than 18, and this young lady is 16 or under. Would this, I guess, change your answer in terms of school nurse?
The requirement is suspicion. So that is all the nurse, the requirement. So if the nurse has suspicion, then they have to report it. But if the student walks in and just asks for information, and which doesn't have relevant suspicion, they're not required to report anything, and they're not required to investigate at all.
Well,
Mr. Croft?
yeah, so I'm staring at the sexual abuse provision 035, which basically it's 3 years. If you're 15 or under, it's just 3 years of difference. And if it's 16 or 17, it's 3 years of difference and a position of authority, some authority. And if you're 18, outside the scope of that, obviously. So, is a purpose of this that you think that a 16-year-old comes in and says, I'd like to know where I can get contraceptive information, and they're supposed to say, is it with somebody 3 years older and in a position of authority? They should actively inquire at that point?
In my view, that's not. If the kid came and said, I think I'm pregnant, or I've got chlamydia,
then is that a difference? Then do I say, here's where pregnancy services are offered? I, as the nurse or counselor now, should say, was it Was it your parents? Was it somebody in authority? Was it a teacher? Was it 3 years older? I should start those lines of questions.
My view is yes. My wife, as a professional counselor, says absolutely. And the welfare of that child is preeminent. And finding out if they're abused or not, at least the first few questions that would help them know whether or not it was a cause for reporting.
And if 18, there's a few 18-year-olds in there, same inquiry, were you raped? I mean, it's outside of sexual abuse of a minor, but, okay, so...
Yeah, so we're basically saying in our state that there's an age at which you are capable of making decisions of a sexual nature. And so a child who's below that age is deemed in Alaska law as not having the capacity to make that decision.
Well, they get to make it if they're near the same age. So I don't know that that's a subtext or a basis for this, because it says if 16-year-old and they're a 16-year-old, there's no penalty nor prohibition.
Yeah, so that's getting into the criminal penalties against the perpetrator, and it's a bit beyond what I'm able to recall right now.
Thank you.
Constable.
So functionally then, what you're suggesting is it's not a mandatory reporting, it's a mandatory inquiry.
That's not what I'm suggesting. I'm suggesting the state law be in our city ordinances so our city prosecutor can prosecute folks for not reporting.
But at some point, if we're talking about the school district and a nurse, and somebody comes into her office, but she doesn't have a general suspicion, but the kid said, I had sex, then what I'm hearing is that the nurse would then be required to inquire.
I don't know that. I think that's a policy decision for the school board and so on. The reporting is only when they have reason to suspect that it's statutory rape. And that is more than 3 years delta, or it's an adult with a young child. It's statutory rape. I want the prosecutor, ma'am.
Sure. If we're talking about 850-045, I think a couple thoughts. Realistically, I think it's a hard crime to prosecute unless you have a straight out admission or some sort of smoking gun, so to speak. I think probably more efficient for the state to try those types of crimes to prosecute it if it's in conjunction with a criminal prosecution for an underlying neglect or abuse, or maybe we see it in the context of a child in need of aid case. I really don't know how many cases that the state prosecutes under this code. One factor I look at is, do I see any reported cases in Westlaw? Didn't find any. And we don't even have a pattern jury instruction on it. So it's not one that is prosecuted a lot.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean that we can't.
Yeah, or it shouldn't, but
or it shouldn't.
Yeah.
I think it's just going to be difficult. It may be difficult,
it is,
but
and you don't. None of us have the mechanism to find out who didn't report. You find it out afterwards when you got a victim, and so on. And oh, did you ever tell anybody? Yeah, I told my counselor or whoever, and they didn't report it 4 years ago. Or during the prosecution of somebody, you've got somebody, and he or she has sexually assaulted a couple of people, and 3 or 4 people crawl out of the woodwork and come and say, that jerk got me too, and I told adult X and official Y, and they didn't prosecute it or report it on. That's how we'll get to someone, but rarely will your investigators find out. It's going to be when there's a report of harm, it comes out. And my goal is to get these exploiters of kids and stop them as early in their career as possible, and get those victims resources and help, counseling and whatever, and wherever you go to get a healed heart. Mr. Gates.
Yes, I want to make a point in response to Mr. Clark's point about the age of consent being 16.
Yeah.
You pointed to the ordinance.
Yes.
Sexual abuse of a minor. But what is not here is that this is a modeled after sexual abuse of a minor in the 4th degree. What isn't here is in state laws, sexual abuse of a minor in the 3rd degree, and that's a Class C felony. That's why we're not adopting it in code. What that is, it's very short. It's when the victim is 13, 14, or 15 years old, and excuse me, let me read it real quick. An offender commits the crime, being 17 years of age or older, the offender engages in sexual contact. That doesn't say penetration, it's sexual contact. But the person who's 13, 14, or 15 years of age, and at least 4 years younger than the offender, so Mr. Dyson's concern that he's pointed out several times, a young adult male, 20, 13, 14-year-old female. And that's a Class C felony, which we're not putting in code, but it is illegal. And if this young lady's 14, goes to the school nurse asking for, information on being tested for STDs and so forth, I mean, I don't know what school nurses are supposed to do. I would be concerned though. So I think that that's why we see a disconnect here, because that's a Class C felony. It doesn't say anything about position of authority of the victim or anything at all. And you're right though that age 16 in the state of Alaska is the age of consent. So this doesn't try to criminalize a 16-year-old female who consents to a relationship, someone with no authority over them, like an athletic coach, and is there. So it doesn't try to criminalize that situation. It doesn't do anything different than state law.
Mr. Chair, I wanted to make sure that we had the opportunity for another practical point. My understanding, and Ms. Davis can speak to this in greater depth, is that we don't presently prosecute juvenile offenders through the municipality, nor do we have the capacity or an existing contract with our juvenile justice system to house any juvenile offenders. So to the extent we're looking at 850-030, the sexting language as a new offense, which would be raised against juvenile offenders, or 850-030 as that window of folks who are under 18 who might be prosecuted under this. We, again, we speak more in depth. We don't necessarily have the practical capacity to do that right now, and there'd be a resource question if we wanted to go that route as a prosecutor's office to make that possible.
Good point. Thank you. Any other comments? Yes, ma'am.
My name is Samantha, and I'm an advocate at STAR, and we have concerns.
Could you come up a little closer, please?
My name is Samantha, and I'm an advocate at STAR, and we have a few concerns with the ordinances that are before you. The first is the possible criminalization of children.
Sorry, speak up a little more.
Okay.
Come closer.
Well, come closer and shout.
We're just getting old. It's a problem. That's not you.
Part of our concern is the possible criminalization of minors if they're not reporting crimes that are happening between adults. So whether it's the instances of domestic violence or other people that are in a position of authority to them, while it's unlikely that it would be prosecuted, it's still possible, and that's a concern for us. Additionally, the fact that it would be, that sounds like you're asking nurses to be trained to be investigators, is a concern for us, as we know that the police and OCS have their own way of investigating crimes, especially those as serious as sexual assault, where minors are brought to a child advocacy center in a particular environment, and it's really important that they not be given any leading statements prior to that. That any kind of inquiry needs to be really prescribed, and that appropriate training needs to be provided to anybody that would be doing such an inquiry. On top of that, we want to make sure, and I think Mr. Dunbar already alluded to this, that there's no penalties for somebody who doesn't want to make a report to police, but did want to do an anonymous victim report.
Give a what?
An anonymous victim report. If an adult has been sexually assaulted within the municipality, they are allowed to contact a forensic nurse and get a forensic kit done on their body and make a statement, and that information be held until the time that they choose to release it to law enforcement. We want to make sure that this ordinance does not impede their ability to do so. because somebody else may report to police in accordance with the law.
All right. I will inquire of Mr. Gates whether or not we can delete those portions from the state code that having to do with adults. But there's nothing in existing code, state, or what we're proposing here, or most professional ethics that requires the counselor to be an investigator.
Yeah. Just some of the comments that you had made were concerning to that effect.
All right.
But I appreciate you trying to keep kids safe. That is incredibly important. We just want to make sure we're not creating investigators when we already have people who are appropriately trained to do so.
Yep. We're encouraging reporters. Mr. Gates, or Ms. Dahl, Chief, did you want to comment? All right, Mr. Gates, and then we're going to quit.
Just really quick, in state law, Title 47, 47, 17, 20, provision, that chapter has a whole bunch of provisions about the investigative process when interviewing teachers. And this ordinance doesn't change any of that. OCS still takes the lead in reviewing, investigating, and so forth. So all this ordinance does is that step of mandatory reporting, making that report to OCS, and gives prosecutors the need to address that directly.
Any further comments? Mr. Dunbar.
Yeah, unfortunately we're out of time. I would ask the chairman, before we vote on this, I think there should be another hearing or work session, or perhaps we go into discussion and then push it to another meeting, however we want to proceed with that. I'm always, I mean, you and I have worked on criminal justice things before at the state level. They're really complicated. They end up having different kind of reverberations. It was my understanding, and I don't remember where I heard this, but I remember years ago hearing that the state had never prosecuted one of these cases. That they had never prosecuted someone for failure to report. I don't know if anyone here knows anything contradicting that, but I believe, because as the prosecutor indicated, it's difficult to report, and usually you'd be going after someone like a school nurse or a counselor who, I think very rarely you have sort of the Michigan State, or Penn State, or some other football powerhouse that refuses to report.
Very good. Olympic Society.
But yeah, so. But I do think it's important. I think we get it right. And I think what you were talking about aspirationally, I don't think that's what actually the state law says when it comes to school nurses and reporting and investigating. And I think what you're asking us to do in incorporating the state law actually is more in line with what the advocates are asking for. That is, it's not forcing school nurses to become investigators the moment they realize that a student is sexually active. The last thing I want to say is, and this goes back to what Chris was saying, the sexting provision that's here, you don't want to call it that, but I mean, you do use the word sexting in the whereases, and then you have this provision. It seems a little out of place to me. It seems like you have this mandatory reporting ordinance, which makes a lot of sense to me, and then this other portion, which I'm not totally sure why that's there, aside from it also involves children. I wonder if we want to talk about maybe bifurcating that and having two ordinances, but anyway, we have more discussions certainly coming.
If we have a quick comment on that, I would also, to Corey's point, I believe we also actually already have an offense under Title VIII that we can use to prosecute sexting offenses. So if we bifurcate that discussion, that might be it is kind of a different thing that we might be able to deal with under existing code and can be addressed separately.
Good catch.
Just real quick question.
Mr. Croft.
Yeah, I know we're out of time, but to Mr. Gates, Rebecca and I talked about it a little. So 035 is the entirety of the sexual abuse of a minor provisions. That is, and it says, as we talked about, if you're 16 or 17, it's got to be a position of authority and 3 years difference. If it's 15 or under, it's just 3 years difference. So a 10-year-old sleeping with a 10-year-old is not a crime, you'll ask?
My understanding is that it is not. It's the age difference that makes it a crime. So if it's a 14-year-old and or whatever, 14-year-old and a 10-year-old, then yes, under state law it is a crime, but it's not if it's two 10-year-olds.
Dean, is that yours as well?
Yes, there's a provision about, like you said, 14-year-old and 10-year-old. There is a state law provision about that, but 2 to 13-year-olds, there's something criminal about that I've seen or read.
I guess just thinking about, I don't know, it makes a great deal of difference. If a 10-year-old comes in and says they're pregnant, it's almost like there ought to be an agreement. If a 16-year-old says I want contraception, my instinct is and the law that says it's generally at the age of consent, so it crosses from something that should have a lot of inquiry to not much of your business. You know what I mean?
Yep.
And so I'm not sure how to spotlight that from oh yeah, I want to know more to not.
Yeah, it's pretty mature set of laws and principles. Virtually all these professional organizations and so on, and the one my wife belonged to, absolutely have that clear. You know, and you're not going out looking for problems. When evidence shows up, you know, that it could be, then there's a responsibility. And I didn't ask it earlier, but I'd like some feedback to you also on the school district policy. When is there a necessity or for the nurse or teacher to tell the parents? You can get back to me on that. But when can you, under school policy, exclude the parents from the loop on knowing what's going on with their kid? So, and we can get back to that one offline. And we will have another work session. We will not vote on this for at least a month. And we're adjourned, and thank you.